Okay, so here we are starting session 11, and I mentioned last time that we'd be having a surprise this session, and the surprise is that I will be the cohort rep on the call, and I have a good friend of mine who's going to be doing the presentation. So we're going to switch things up here a bit, and the good friend I have presenting is Dr. Sean Patrick Hatt, who has a private psychotherapy practice in Seattle Integrative Psychology, and who also knows a lot about this particular evening's topic, contemplative neuroscience. So I'm going to be the cohort rep, and Sean's going to sort of take over and show the slides and present them to you and with commentary, and I will do my best to ask questions and get clarifications and anything else that I think would be useful to you folks. All right. Take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to do this. It's fun.
Yeah.
Any excuse that we have to talk about this stuff is great.
Yeah.
Because I always learn so much in talking with you about this, and putting together this presentation was fun for me because it helps me continue to get more and more clear about what it is that I'm doing and why it's a little bit, maybe a little bit different. And because I think I may combine the stuff in a unique, I think we all do in a unique way, whatever kind of discipline we're in.
Right.
I think we all bring our own signature kind of presence to it. So this is just kind of the way it's evolving for me and my thinking about how this might work. So this is a continuing story, really about integration.
Could you turn your volume up just a little?
Yeah, and for some reason, what's going on here?
I mean, I can hear you, but it's a little low.
Yeah,
can you hear me all right?
Let's see. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, that's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Well, let me see if I hit my space bar, if it'll switch slides.
Yeah.
No, it's not. Let's try this. There. I'll have to use my mouse. That's okay.
Yeah.
So I want to start off, as you have each week, by posing some open questions.
Great.
That we can hold in the background as we go through this. And hopefully all these questions will get answered, but if any of them don't get answered sufficiently, then my email address will be presented at the end.
Okay, great.
So people can dialogue with me about this stuff if they feel like they want to do that. But
and you welcome contact, right?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, great.
I may not get back to you right away, but I definitely welcome the contact. So feel free.
Because you know the power of contingent communication.
I do. Even though, admittedly, it's an edge for me. I need to work on it.
It's an edge for all of us.
So the first question that comes up is, how did we arrive at a place where contemplative neuroscience informs psychological healing practice? And so we're going to do a little review about how psychotherapy practice, and regardless of what kind of healing practice you happen to be in, for the folks that are on this call, you can substitute whatever healing practice you're in, or parenting practice, or teaching practice, or whatever it happens to be. Psychology and psychotherapy is just my world. But this really relates to anything that has to do with attuned, connected human relationships.
Yeah. So there are teachers on the call, there are midwives on the call, there are massage practitioners, all kinds of alternative folks.
Great. Yeah. So don't be put off by the psychotherapeutic language. Just substitute your own discipline where it shows up. So how does relationship work or not in human healing and development.
Okay.
What's the prime directive of social neuroscience? And you guys probably already know what that is, because I'm guessing that Mark has probably already brought that to your attention, but I think it's important to bring it.
Good to review.
Again, yeah. What's a model for understanding what I'm calling an integrated relational contemplative healing discipline? And we'll review 9 types of neurocycle spiritual integration, hopefully fairly quickly and briefly. And then this is an open question. I'm not sure we'll directly answer it. We may answer it along the way, but it's kind of a dialogue question. What do you think is going on in the brain when we're engaged in relational contemplative practice or healing practice? Given what you now know about the brain, which should be quite a bit given what you've been through with Mark already, you might be able to answer that question in some interesting ways for yourself. What healing benefits in a relationship might become possible if we were to adopt these things in our lives? And then lastly, and this is kind of an interesting open question, in my world, is transcendence of suffering, of a suffering self, a legitimate therapeutic goal? Or is that better left to temples and caves in the Far East?
Uh-huh.
I think that this is the ultimate healing work that can be done. And as we'll see later in the talk, I think that an integrated contemplative relational healing discipline that takes into consideration neuroscience and the biological basis of our experience may have something to say about can we get beyond the limitations of a suffering self? And I think the answer to that is yes, we can.
All right, a little louder would be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to review the arc of development of psychotherapy. And this is pertinent because it mirrors in many ways just the healing zeitgeist more generally, the way that we think about the human body and the human being and how it heals. And in our case, in my world, it began with psychoanalysis and Freud, of course.
Freud was a neurologist.
He was a neurologist. That's true. He was, wasn't he?
Yeah.
They didn't know a lot. They didn't know much about the brain when Freud was.
No, he was flying blind.
Mm-hmm. And then came behaviorism, and that's a picture of John Watson. And in both of these cases, the psychoanalytic, the doctor fixes the patient by focusing on the contents of the unconscious, and the goal is being cured. And there's a real power dynamic there, and that gets mirrored again in behaviorism, where there's a doctor fixing the patient, but this time focusing on an interaction between environment and behavior.
Yeah.
But the goal is prediction and control in that case.
Pretty narrow.
It's pretty narrow, and it's pretty reductionistic. And then we get to the cognitive movement.
Aaron Beck.
A picture of Aaron Beck, where we're talking about fixing distorted or erroneous thinking, with the goal being reduction of symptoms in that way. And then lastly, and this started in the 1950s, this is a picture of Nathan Klein, who started to treat patients with schizophrenia with a drug called Reserpine in 1953. He also pioneered lithium as an antidepressant. So we have him to thank for that.
Which has helped a lot of people, actually.
It has. Yeah, it absolutely has.
Yeah.
So all these were reductionistic in nature. That is, that we're dealing with isolating and eliminating things that are broken and their causes. But then we had some challengers of the zeitgeist come up, and then we had the humanistic movement. This is Fritz Perls, who was the father of Gestalt therapy. And then we had person-centered, and this is Carl Rogers. We had existential psychotherapy come up. This is Jim Hugenthal, and then Virginia Satir and other practitioners that were dealing with human beings as a function of or as a part of larger family systems And so these all began to take a more egalitarian kind of relational approach that was rooted in the belief that if we were just left to our own devices, we have a natural tendency to move toward our own healing and our own health. And so what we try to do as healers in that way is to have that kind of belief, that genuine belief in the basic goodness and the power of the human spirit and the human body to heal itself. And we have to just try to help facilitate that as best.
So it's interesting because as you present these this way, I mean, it's clearly a developmental progression that has been unfolding for the last 100 years or so.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. And I think that continues.
Yeah, and speeding up.
With just more knowledge, right? But then we had some other challengers to the zeitgeist. We had the so-called transhumanistic movement, and that's Abraham Maslow. This was in the 60s, and the transpersonal movement. Stan Grof and William Broad being a couple of the luminaries in the transpersonal movement. And then we had an attempt by Ken Wilber to bring together an integral approach that really brought it all together, the physical sciences and social sciences and psychological and spiritual technologies, and bring the whole thing together in kind of a unifying theory. And then more recently, Martin Seligman has been involved in studying our highest potential in terms of health and happiness. We've done a great job of concentrating in healing practice of all stripes as to trying to identify and fix what's broken or what's wrong. And folks like Martin Seligman have been trying to answer or get answers to the question, what are we doing right? And what about people who are extremely successful and happy and high functioning? What can we learn from studying that?
Yeah.
How can we then apply, right? How can we then apply that to our lives?
Instead of studying ill people, what happens if we study happy, well people?
Well people, exactly. It's a revolutionary idea. It's good stuff.
Okay.
So now we add to that kind of basic developmental trajectory some enhanced understandings that have come to pass around attachment, trauma, and the brain.
Right.
So, and this may be some review
Yeah,
material
that's
as well,
fine.
so I won't dwell on it a lot. But attachment theory, we came to understand the role of early childhood relationships as important influences on the style in which we tend to relate to one another throughout our whole lifespan.
That's where we lay down the map, the early maps.
That's right. And then in adulthood, this was expanded by Mary Main to include not only, she discovered a disorganized attachment style in childhood, but in adulthood, what she called an earned secure attachment style, which is really, I think, the function of good psychotherapy is to facilitate this earned secure attachment in adulthood.
So basically you're saying that even if we didn't have the best early start in life,
Exactly.
we have the potential to correct that.
We can correct it.
Yeah.
We can correct it, and that's a function of our neuroplasticity, that our brains are capable of changing the way they're organized.
Yeah.
So the key characteristics of this earned secure attachment are metacognition and integration, that is the ability to elaborate a theory of mind for another person,
Uh-huh.
and an ability to reflect upon one's own mind. So
like contemplation.
right, contemplate and reflect on it. We can actually think about our own mind, think about our own thinking. That's a major developmental leap to be able to do that. That kind of abstraction takes some horsepower in our brains.
You know, what's really interesting about that is that people who can do that easily, reflect on their own thinking, often think that everyone can do it.
Right, and that's just not true.
Right.
That's just not true. And in fact, where that tends to show up maybe most prominently is the assumptions that we make about our teenagers and their ability to think reflectively.
Right.
And there's been a lot of writing done about the teenage brain, most recently a new book by Stan Siegel, which I have not yet read, and maybe you've read it, the Brainstorm.
Yeah, we think of teenagers as little adults.
Right, exactly, and they're not.
They're not, especially under stress.
Right, right. So the key marker of health in this case, if we're looking through an attachment lens, is the capacity to form a coherent narrative.
How would you define that?
Well, it means that the stories that we relate about our life,
Early life.
and this is regardless of whether or not we had a good early life or not. This is really about even if we had a rough time of it early in our lives, we're able in adulthood, if we've done this kind of work, we're able in adulthood to put together a story about this experience that has orientation, that is a clear sense of context and the people, the participants in the drama, the structure, that is the events are connected over time and they're organized, and affect, that is that the emotions and the feelings and evaluations of events are present in the narrative. We're not dissociated from it. We're not trying to put a silver lining in the cloud. It's real. We can talk about it. We can experience the emotion. And then we connect it all together in a way that makes meaning, that integrates meaning. It's connected to the whole thing, to the orientation, structure, and affect.
So in other words, an example that comes to mind for me is like, my mother struggled all her life with alcoholism. So how I make sense of that is I know a little bit about her personal history. Like her father died of her mother poisoning him with poisoned food. And she never, ever grieved that loss or recovered from it.
Right.
And used alcohol as medicine.
Right. Right. Which gives you the capacity to locate compassion in yourself for your mother.
Exactly.
Out of that, and right out of all of that,
you
can make meaning of it, and you can find compassion in yourself, and there's so much power in that. There's in not being victimized by these stories.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Understanding the enormous amount of suffering, especially at the time that she grew up during the wars and everything. I mean, that's the only response I can have.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then to have that same sense of integration and coherence in your own story, in your own narrative, and how you showed up in that environment, and how you can now tell a story about your own life that is meeting all of those.
That I can make sense of, and that I have a structure and orientation.
You have an orientation and structure, and you're very in touch with the difficulty and the pain in your experience, and it all comes together with a great deal of meaning. In fact, I mean, it's driving in some ways the reason that we're all together tonight.
Right. And it's summarized in the realization that it's not me, it's my brain.
Exactly. It's your brain. Your brain behaving badly.
Exactly.
That's right. That's right. So the question is, how does trauma experienced in our early life factor in? How does it drive our behavior? How does it, when our brain is behaving badly, how does that show up? This is a little video that will help us understand better how, and this is language I'm sure you've heard with Mark before because it's language that he taught me, was that healing is always trying to happen. It's an optimistic view. Again, it goes back to that idea from the humanistic traditions where, left to our own devices, human beings are miraculous creatures who are always moving toward greater health and wholeness. What we need to do is figure out how that's trying to happen and try to help create the conditions for more of it to happen, right?
Right.
So this is how this video talks about how healing tries to happen in the presence of care providers and healers in the allopathic medical system.
Is it video or audio?
it's a little video.
Okay.
And how it often results in reenactments of the very same traumatic issues over and over again, which is what prevents secure attachment from happening.
Right.
So paradoxically, healing's trying to happen naturally, but yet we recreate the conditions over and over again that prevent healing from happening, if that makes sense. So let's just watch it. This is a really nice, clear explanation of what's going on.
Okay.
Kaiser Permanente, an integrated healthcare system in California, launched a research project called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. They surveyed 17,000 middle-class patients on their exposure to trauma in early childhood and then examined their healthcare records. And when they did this, they uncovered an important correlation. It turns out that children who are exposed to trauma, abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction often go on to become frequent utilizers, even super utilizers of the healthcare system as adults. But why? Well, perhaps, and not surprisingly, it has a lot to do with learned behaviors. Exposure to extreme stress changes the brain pathways of children and sets them up for a lifetime of impaired social and emotional behavior. In short, unhealthy childhood habits become unhealthy lifelong habits. So how does this connect to healthcare? As some experts believe, when a child does grow up in a traumatic or neglectful setting, they often end up in the emergency room for a lot of minor ailments, ear infections, head colds, and other injuries. Ironically, it's also this very trip, the trip to the emergency room, that actually provides a sense of stability. At the ER, adults dress the same, talk the same, and they're kind to children. The kids see it as a safe place, a place they can return to. Unfortunately, as the patient grows older, decades of stress and bad habits increase the likelihood of chronic illness, and the pattern emerges. These same patients begin returning to their place of safety, and as a result, some go on to become healthcare super utilizers, going to the hospital and emergency room hundreds of times per year. These patients will also often introduce conflict with their healthcare providers, once again because of these patterns. After all, conflict is what they know, so conflict is what they create. This behavior then inevitably leads to failing treatment plans, ill health, and tragically, more trips to the doctor. And round we go. So here's the bottom line. When a patient displays troubled behaviors, caregivers may only be seeing the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And if the system doesn't find a way to address all this stuff under here, we're probably not going to see any improvements up here. That's why leaders in the field of trauma-informed care are proposing a paradigm shift. Instead of asking, what's the matter with you? Let's start asking, what happened to you? Considering what we now know, it may be the most effective starting point. And ultimately, that's what we all want. A healthcare system that produces better results, lower costs, and makes all of us as a community healthier and safer. And it all starts with asking the right questions. To learn more, go to camdenhealth.org.
That was an interesting take on ACEs.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty cool little video. It takes on some complex ideas, but the thing that I'm struck by is that you can put together that same scenario and substitute any significant other into the role of the nurse behind the intake desk.
Uh-huh.
You can put a teacher in that role. You can put a friend in that role, or an attempt to make friends in that role. You can see how conflict is what they know, so conflict is what they create everywhere they go.
Right.
And so if we could all learn how to be that way with people who are difficult in our lives, maybe just instead of saying, what the hell is wrong with you, we could say,
What happened?
What has happened to you? And how is healing trying to happen right now? How are you trying to get a need met? in a way that's not productive, in a way that's actually serving to reinforce the traumatic patterns that you've had.
Can you put the mic a little closer to your mouth?
Sure. Is that better?
A little bit.
A little bit better?
Yeah.
I'm using this headphone.
Okay.
It's an Apple product.
So last night on 60 Minutes, there was a segment where they have determined that it's cheaper and much more effective to provide homeless people with housing, with good housing, to build units and put them in them than to leave them on the street.
That's a paradoxical intervention.
Right. And so, I mean, it makes sense, though, when you show that little video of the disruption and the constant, I mean, people using emergency rooms,
Right.
you know, as places to go to get help that don't really provide help.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So, in every important relationship, and I'm sure you've heard this before, this is, again, some of the work that Mark has done over the years.
Yeah, it's a little soft, sir.
The
Your
big
boy.
brain question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me better?
No,
Yeah?
it sounds like you're far away or something. I don't know what. It's different than it was earlier.
Let's see. Maybe I've done something to the microphone here. Okay.
All right.
Maybe I just need to speak louder. Is it better?
Yeah, if you speak louder, it's better.
I'll just try to speak louder.
Okay.
It feels a little weird because I can't hear myself because of the earplugs, and so that's maybe why I'm speaking softly. But in every important relationship throughout our lifetime, we're all just trying to get the following question answered in the affirmative, and this is the big brain question that Mark has coined, and I think it's the right. I think it's right on. Are you there for me? I see that all the time in my therapeutic practice. I see it in parenting.
People needing others to be there who aren't.
Right.
Yeah.
Or in the case of people who are successful and happy and able to form a coherent narrative, it's clear that they do get that question answered in the affirmative often. And early and often is best, as we've talked about, right?
Right.
Early and often. But the truth is, any time will do, because insecure attachment is possible. So partners, lovers, teachers, therapists of all stripes.
Banks.
We're not likely to have a healing dialogue with our banker.
Did you see where the post office is looking to turn themselves into a bank?
I don't even go there.
Can you imagine?
That doesn't sound like a great idea.
No, it doesn't. It sounds like the ill marrying the ill.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a great idea. So if that question gets answered in the affirmative in adulthood, right?
Right.
We can form a coherent narrative in spite of ourselves, which is so wonderful. And this is this is what a coherent narrative sounds like, and this is a person that maybe some of you will recognize.
I thought my childhood was difficult, but yours, I think, was more difficult. You had a very violent father, and so you had to, that was your primary challenge in childhood.
Yes.
And without that primary challenge, you probably wouldn't be here now.
I wouldn't. We all, there were 4 boys in my family, and we all used different strategies to deal with the pain, because he was an abusive and violent person and a wife batterer and all these things, and very unpredictable. And sometimes among us we'd get depressed or try to use humor or whatever. I became a family peacemaker, which became my profession later on. But it's partly what took me to the monastery. I had a lot of suffering, and as you said earlier on, our education system focuses outwardly on reading and mathematics and science, but it doesn't focus on the heart. It doesn't teach us either to ask who are we, or what do we do with the suffering of life, or the mystery of aging, none of it. And I needed something desperately. So it was really that calling inside to find some help. And then I read these amazing books about Zen masters, and I said, okay, I want to find one, see if that can help. And fortunately, I was actually able to find some good teachers.
Yes.
You had this remarkable experience of really doing it on your own,
Yes.
which is both unusual. I mean, a lot of people try, but also, in many ways much more difficult because you didn't have anybody to talk to say, well, what happened?
Yes, this is why I had to seek people out after that shift to understand it. So I went to Buddhist monasteries, I talked to some monks, and I sought other places I went to investigating, trying to understand. And it's through Buddhism that I understood it, began to understand a lot that had happened to me. Otherwise I wouldn't have been able to understand at all.
So I hope you could see the features of a coherent narrative forming there, and places where Jack Kornfield was able to get what he needed in order to do that healing, to have the conditions whereby healing could happen naturally.
Yeah.
And now he passes that along to the people that he works with, both as a spiritual teacher and as a psychologist.
I'm reading Mark Epstein's book where he makes this pretty convincing argument that Buddha went in search of his own healing and discovered, much like Eckhart Tolle there, on his own, Buddhism as a response to the fact that his mother died 5 days after he was born.
Direct experience.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Marky, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, good. I lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
He discovered it directly.
Right. Well, through a lot of pursuing, extremes, from hedonism to asceticism,
Right.
and everything in between, and basically followed his own mind, his own life.
Yeah. Yeah, and the book that you're reading by Epstein, is it The Trauma of Everyday Life?
Yeah.
most recent one?
Yeah.
I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think he brings forth some interesting thinking around that. Of course, he's trained in the psychoanalytic tradition. There's a long history of dialogue between Buddhism and psychoanalysis. It goes back a long way. It goes back to Freud's time.
Right.
And he talks a little bit about the mechanism of healing in terms of being able to meet ourselves with that safe, loving presence, which I think is part of what happens when we have an experience of this trusted, loving other as a healer or as a friend or as a lover. We can internalize that experience for ourselves, and it becomes a part of who we are, this compassionate, wise other who can then begin internally to meet the suffering self, to meet the part of us that is still raw and infantile and demanding and frightened,
Right.
and ready to reenact all of these traumatic patterns. Right? We internalize this wise, compassionate other and learn to meet ourselves with it. He articulates that pretty nicely, I think.
Well, that's what Cornfield basically was saying. He met some really good teachers,
Right.
like Ajahn Chah, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and he internalized those teachers, internalized their message, their compassion, their acceptance and kindness, and was able to meet himself with that same energy. I think
Yeah.
that has a lot to do with it.
I remember one of his books I read, he asked his teacher, like, what's the one thing, if I could only bring one thing back from the East to deliver to the West, what would it be? And the teacher said, tell people to let go of their opinions.
That's great. That's great.
Not so easy to do, though.
No, no. I love those kinds of teachings because they're always pithy.
Right.
They're always awesome. If you could only tell me one thing to do. Right? So for you, as I recall, the teaching that you got that was so profound was shelter people, right? Wasn't that a key? Like,
Provide shelter for people.
Provide shelter for people.
Right.
You got that teaching.
I did. And I did do that for 30 years.
Yeah.
And some, metaphorically, I'm still doing that.
Yeah, which is really cool. It's really cool. Neem Karoli Baba on his deathbed told Ram Dass to feed people. That's all.
Yeah.
Feed people.
And he's still doing that.
He's still doing that. Yeah. It's a cool thing. So, an integrative approach to relational psychotherapy. What does that mean? So, relational psychotherapy, first of all, and this is my kind of my unpacking of it. And again, substitute psychotherapy. Substitute. What is relational teaching? What is relational midwifery? What is relational parenting? What does it mean? Right? First of all, in my world, in psychotherapy land, it's integrative. That is, it fosters neural integration in the crucible of relationship with an attuned, compassionate other. So, in doing that, it addresses traumatic wounds in the unthought known. I know that's a term that Mark has introduced to you at some point.
Uh-huh.
By addressing how thoughts, feelings, and patterns of relating have come together over time. So we have an appreciation, we have a compassionate understanding for how this person might be showing up, for how we might be showing up in relationship in a way that's less than productive. So we can meet ourselves with some compassion, some understanding around that. But we also have a biological understanding, some kind of an appreciation for how the brain shows up in this, how our bodies show up in this equation. It's work that's done most powerfully in the here and now, the present moment, and what Fritz Perls famously called the safe emergency of the therapeutic situation.
Uh-huh.
And it's about real-time relating. It's about full contact with the other. It's not about contact from a distance. It's about empathy. It's about embodiment. It's not about a detached, blank slate, kind of doctor-patient relationship. It's about really being in relationship with another person, which is risky. Right? And this is a little video that I think you said that maybe they've seen this one, right, Mark, about empathy with Brene Brown?
Yeah. The difference between empathy and sympathy.
Yeah, I think it's important to reiterate this.
Absolutely. Let's review.
She does a beautiful job of it in this case.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had a, yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think that's so right on.
So
Go ahead.
So not only do you have to give up your opinions, but you have to learn how to be comfortable with uncomfortable feelings.
Right. And the most uncomfortable feeling that we can experience as human beings is not knowing. Not knowing.
Right.
We hate that. We don't know not knowing what to do, not knowing the answer, not knowing what to say next. It's so difficult to be with not knowing and not needing to know.
And knowing or trusting that it isn't actually enough.
Right. That's so pivotal, I think, in this. And contemplative practice helps us to lean into unpleasantness. It helps us to lean into not knowing.
Yeah.
And learn to befriend it. And that's one of the main benefits, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so effective as a part of lots of different healing disciplines or relational disciplines like parenting,
Yeah.
teaching, or nursing, any of these things. There was a study that just came out today, and I meant to grab it. I put it up on my professional Facebook page. I shared it. I had a moment this morning when I saw it. It came across on Medline. It talked about, was it Medline? No, it was the Center for Greater Good at Berkeley, and it was about the benefits of mindfulness as practiced by physicians, and in terms of creating a better connection with their patients and having the patients experience them in that way. And they studied a bunch of family physicians, and they interviewed patients of doctors that both did and didn't do mindful contemplative practice, and they found that things were a lot better with folks that did. Not surprisingly.
Yeah.
It was an interesting study. Still haven't read the study, but there's a little article on the Center for Greater Good.
So that suggests that the quality of the neurophysiology of the healer impacts the patients.
Exactly.
Irrespective of whatever they might do or say.
They're more available. They're more available for connection.
Huh.
Which brings us to the prime directive of social neuroscience.
Uh-huh.
Right? Less organized brains borrow the resources of more organized brains in order to develop.
Right. So if you have a physician who isn't very well connected internally himself, he's basically going to write you prescriptions.
Yeah, or worse.
Or worse.
This is a personal story of a physician that didn't have a great sense of integration, didn't have the capacity to be empathic and be with difficulty, which was so surprising because he was in a field that deals with great difficulty, people suffering in massive ways. He's a neurologist. And my father-in-law went to see this guy to get a second opinion about what we had come to suspect was ALS. And unfortunately, this guy confirmed that it was indeed ALS. And we went through what turned out to be a pretty brief journey with this physician as my father-in-law's condition worsened very rapidly and passed away only a couple of months after we began seeing this guy. But along the way, we had had a whole series of conversations about how we were going to handle life and what was going to happen. And
with the doctor?
With as a family, and then we went to see the doctor. My wife and my mother-in-law went with my father-in-law, and they had decided already that when the time came, my father-in-law was not interested in a feeding tube.
Right.
He would elect to just end his own life, given that we're a right to die state here in Washington. But he was not going to take a feeding tube. He wanted to go right away into hospice care. He had already lost his capacity to swallow almost completely. He was really having a very difficult time. And so the experience went something like this. My father-in-law sits down with the doctor, has a pad of paper because it's the only way that he can communicate now. And the doctor said, well, I'm a little concerned about your weight loss.
You're kidding.
I think we're going to have to start talking about a feeding tube. And my father-in-law took the pad, his yellow pad and a pen, and he wrote down in all caps, which is the way he always did it. It's how he typed too, all caps, no feeding tube. And then underneath that he wrote, want pill equals death. This was his way of explaining that he wanted to engage with the Washington State Right to Die law.
Uh-huh.
And the doctor, according to my wife at that point, looked at my father-in-law, looked up with a baffled look on his face, turned his back on my father-in-law to face my mother-in-law and my wife, and said, yeah, I don't know about those things, but here's how the feeding tube works.
Wow.
Right?
So he couldn't deal with it.
He could not integrate that moment. He could not. His own neurobiology was overwhelmed by the pain and the sadness and the grief.
Right.
And so he shut off. He shut down.
So that just makes suffering for everyone.
And it did. It created a lot of suffering for my family.
Yeah.
So that's one. That's just an example of how I think
Healers need to do their own work.
Healers need to do their own inner work, exactly, in order to be able to lend their more organized neurobiology to people when they're in need.
Mm-hmm.
So in an integrative relational psychotherapy, and again, this is kind of getting into my own evolving thinking about this, but the appreciation for a biological basis for our experiences and behaviors serves as a means of making sense and accessing self-compassion, which emerges from an understanding of how the body is manifesting psychospiritual healing in the flesh and bone realm and body. It's foundational to creating a coherent narrative. We need to understand how we're made and how we suffer in particular. And the more I think that we can do that, we can meet ourselves with self-compassion, as Mark models so beautifully in his story about his mother and how he made sense out of her, and how he has in turn made sense out of his own life from this compassionate place. It's foundational to creating a coherent. You heard it in Jack Kornfield's piece as well. The sense-making, self-compassion arising from this understanding of how this healing process is going.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that Mark taught me a long time ago, when he got me interested in neuroscience, was he said that the more I come to understand how my own brain works, the easier it is for me to manage my own emotionality, my own difficulty, my own suffering. Because I can picture in my own mind, what's happening. I can see in my mind's eye the brain structures that are involved in creating problems. It's really helpful to understand our own brains in that way.
Yeah. It's been transformative for me.
Yeah.
And here's another piece of it. Even those times when I'm hijacked,
Right.
I recover much more quickly.
Sure. I love how you talked about the emergency that you dealt with when your chimney caught.
Right.
That was a perfect example.
Yeah.
Of understanding your experience in a way that was really self-compassionate and wonderful. I can imagine lots of my own clients maybe having had maybe a similar experience, how they would come in and they would probably talk to me about how stupid they feel.
Right.
That they didn't know what to do. And how could they be so stupid and so inadequate that they just didn't know what to do and that they had to ask a stranger,
Yeah.
what do I do? Right.
I wasn't stupid. It was my brain.
Exactly. Your brain did the only thing that it could do in
Right.
a situation like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's helpful, I think, to understand the biology that's working here. And so, and this is a quick description about how that biology is at work in terms of how the energy and information is flowing in different directions and in different ways inside the brain. So the first way that it flows is vertically. So it means that the body and the limbic structures, which are those structures in the middle of the brain that deal with strong emotions like fear, terror, anger, right? And then the prefrontal areas, which are right behind the eyes, which are much higher level executive function, empathic connection, attunement, and all these kinds of things, these wonderful relational things, right?
Yeah.
Vertical integration means that our body and our limbic system and those prefrontal areas are all wired together. Lots and lots of connections.
Yeah, so this is a really important part of integration, and that is that integration happens when we actually increase the number of nerve fibers and the connections they're making in these different directions.
Right.
So from a childhood to old age, you know, these fibers are constantly in a state of plastic change.
Right. Which is why you're able to unfreeze in a situation that maybe 20 years ago you might not have been able to unfreeze yourself.
Like public speaking.
Right? Like public speaking, right? You tell a great story about how you came to be fearful in that kind of an environment because of a teacher that introduced you to fear and shame in the classroom.
Right.
A long time ago, right? Junior high, right?
Right, it was junior high, 7th grade.
High school.
Yeah.
So vertical integration is what allows us to tolerate all these strong emotions without completely freaking out.
Right.
And then the next one is horizontal integration. Right? So like a house with solid foundation, it's built upon strong vertical integration. That's about increasing connections across top to bottom. Now we've got to increase connections across both sides, across the center of the brain, the corpus callosum. Right? We got to have connections that flow both directions.
And so what actually happens with horizontal is the corpus callosum gets thicker and wider and has many more connections going across.
And this is what enables us to put language to feelings and emotions.
Right.
And make meaning out of all of this stuff as it's arising. Make meaning out of our inner world.
And most people have a strength in one hemisphere or the other. And so my experience is the one where we are weakest is the one that we probably would be well served to spend the most time doing activities to help increase connectivity and neurons in it.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
I mean, that's why I went to ITP, because, it was a right brain school, and I spent my whole life in left brain schools.
Right. Yeah, I had a similar experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I was an Army officer before I went to, before I discovered a naturopathic medical school, and then after that, ITP.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a huge shift. And very uncomfortable at first, but I took to it quickly.
That's an
So the
important
next-
piece, the discomfort initially.
Oh, the initial discomfort was excruciating
Yeah.
when I went to Bastyr, and the experiential learning that went on there was just, I felt like I was going to crawl out of my own skin.
A little louder.
So the next part is narrative memory and state integration,
Uh-huh.
and this is the natural outcome of either secure attachment in childhood or earned secure attachment in adulthood.
Right.
So we've come to terms with personal history. We can talk about it in a coherent, emotionally engaged, and managed way. Dan Siegel calls this mind sight. Right? It's the marriage of empathy and insight. It's the ability to bring together these states of memories in a narrative. We can think about and observe our own and others' thoughts. We can think about and reflect on our own minds and the minds of others. We can recreate the mind of another in our own mind.
Also known as theory of mind.
Theory of mind.
Right. Which is necessary for empathy.
Yeah, for sure. Right. That's being able to create that feeling state that another person is experiencing inside yourself.
Right.
And experience it as if it's real. So the next one is consciousness integration.
So these are like building. It's like building a structure, actually.
Yeah, it is. It starts kind of with the most basic building blocks and works its way up into the stratosphere, right?
Yeah, continue to add. Okay.
Yeah. So consciousness integration is the ability to move back and forth between the inner world and the outer world. So this is something that we practice in meditation.
Contemplative neuroscience, yeah.
We get into the present moment, into the here and now, and we're able to move back and forth in a fluid way between tracking and our inner experience and allowing and accepting what's happening outside of us. We can do both. We can work with what's here now, internally as well as externally.
So let me ask you this. So if the doctor that was working with your father-in-law had actually accomplished this, how would he have responded to your father-in-law's sign?
I kind of have two answers to that. One is an answer that in a perfect world
Uh-huh.
he would have gotten. And the other is an answer that would have been incrementally better than what we got based on the reality of who owns Swedish Hospital now, which is the Sisters of Providence system.
A little louder?
So what I think somebody who was integrated, well, maybe let's do this. Let's get to the seventh kind of integration.
Okay.
Try to imagine what a fully integrated response would have been, because the last kind of integration is interpersonal.
Right.
In that we are constantly in relationship, whether we know it or not, right? And so we've got to be in contact with that. We've got to be clear about what we think, how we feel about ourselves and about others.
Uh-huh.
We've got to be able to, in the consciousness integration realm, we've got to be able to fluidly move between our inner states and outer states with the information that's coming in. Right? And in this case, the information that's coming in from another person.
Right.
Right? So what would an integrated response have looked like with my father-in-law? Well, first, he would have, if he had good vertical integration, he would have been aware of the tension in his own body,
Uh-huh.
and the nausea, maybe the helplessness that he was feeling, the emotions, strong emotions that he was feeling, and maybe he could meet himself with some gentleness around that. He might have even reported that he was feeling some sadness to hear that, but also a sense of tension. He might have even acknowledged that the tension in the reality of the situation is that he's not able.
It goes all against his training.
It goes against his training as a physician, right? I don't like to give up. I don't like
Right.
to admit defeat, right? That's a big part of it. But he's also not able. He's not able to assist a patient because of the Catholic Church will not allow physicians in that Providence system to assist patients in obtaining the medicine that's required for ending one's own life in this life.
So he's in a real bind.
He's in a big time bind, right? And so there's all this stuff coming up for him that's very difficult, but he could if he had good vertical integration, he'd be able to manage the strong emotions and all of those feelings coming up without dissociating, without just shutting down.
Right.
And he would have been able, because he had good horizontal integration, he would have been able to put language to all these complex feelings
Uh-huh.
and make and inform thoughts and ideas that might help to deal with some of the conflicting information that he was getting.
Right.
To deal with the paradoxes inherent in the situation with the double binds, and maybe even rectify some of those. As far as narrative, memory, and state integration, right? He would have been able to imagine what my family was going through,
Uh-huh.
and imagine what my father-in-law was going through, and really connect into what was happening in the other three minds that were in the room besides his own. He would have been able to fluidly move back and forth because his consciousness integration was high. He would have been able to be present, remain present in that difficult space. And then he would have been able to reflect that in the way that he was relating. Even though maybe he even had his own ethical dilemmas around the right to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine to have ethical dilemmas with things, right?
Right.
You just simply say, this is something I can't treat. You don't turn away and offer a feeding tube.
Right, exactly. Well, and then the next one is really important, is temporal integration, right? This is the ability to come and deal with death itself, right?
Right.
So he was clearly uncomfortable with that reality.
Especially being a participant in it.
And being a participant in it, exactly, right? And then the last one is transpirational. And this is kind of reaches into the profound in terms of, and Einstein, I think, expresses it best. He says, a human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from the prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if humanity is to survive.
Right. Einstein had good integration.
That was a highly integrated brain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I read his biography. It's really, really interesting if you look at it from a plastic neuroscience perspective.
Yeah. So, if anyone doubts the power of the mind-body connection, and I doubt that there are too many people on this call who do, this is an interesting little video that illustrates some very highly integrated minds, brains, heart, mind, brain, bodies, as Mark is fond of talking about. So let's just take a look.
For years, Dr. Herbert Benson of the Harvard Medical School has been conducting experiments on Buddhist monks from Tibetan monasteries to assess the effects of meditation on the body's metabolism. His research has provided a remarkable insight into the ways the mind can alter the functioning of the body.
What we found with respect to their oxygen consumption, in simple meditation, they decreased their metabolism upwards of 64%. And this was the largest decrease in oxygen consumption that was ever recorded in experiments by a simple restful procedure.
Carefully monitoring a form of Dzogchen meditation known as Tum Mo, the yoga of inner heat, Benson came up with even more intriguing results.
What we found initially in Tumo was that monks were able to increase their skin temperature in environments of 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
But that was just the beginning.
Well, what we found in these monks in very cold environments of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, wrapping themselves in wet sheets, these monks astoundingly could increase their temperature enough to get the sheets steaming and dry the sheets. You and I would go into uncontrollable shivering and perhaps even die of too low blood pressure. They were quite comfortable there simply by performing their Tumo meditational heat yoga.
When asked how they do it, the monks describe relaxing, focusing on their breathing. They picture air coming in and out as a kind of energy. They visualize it as a flame, a fire coursing through the chest. Dr. Benson has shown that anyone who performs the initial steps of meditation can have a significant effect on their body. Meditation can help the treatment of stress-related health problems, such as anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, and cardiac irregularities.
So you can see all kinds of different integration in that. Okay. Are you there, Mark?
Yeah, I'm here. So the basic thing that I have repeated frequently throughout these sessions is that what we're trying to do is increase our capacity to process energy and information. And this video is like a great illustration of big energy moving through these people's bodies and brains. So much so that it could dry sheets.
Yeah.
You can start your own laundromat with these guys.
And the thing that I think is so amazing, when he talks about how, the narrator talks about how without this kind of training, we would shiver uncontrollably and maybe even die.
Right.
Of hypothermia.
Right.
And being in a 40-degree room wrapped in wet sheets, I can imagine how terrible that would feel. But if you notice how calm they were when they did it,
right.
It's amazing. So the ability, our bodies would immediately react in a way that would be fearful. I can imagine being terrified.
Right.
Of how uncomfortable that would be, because I think instinctively I would know that wow, this is a real threat to my well-being. I'm not sure how long I can hang in this space. And I would start to have a fear-based reaction there. And they have the resources in their minds to not have that kind of a response at all.
And or if they initially did have it, they had the capacity to transcend it, to recover, to relax into it,
Right.
and do their practice.
And transform it, right?
Right.
Transform the states.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So what would a contemplative relational psychotherapy or any other discipline that involves relating in some way that's healing or
Like teaching or
teaching
medicine or
anything. I conceive of this work in terms of the intersection of body, mind, spirit, and relationship.
right.
And so let's just kind of review, let's look at an arc of contemplative psychotherapy, kind of like we did with regular psychotherapy. So it began with a dialogue between Buddhism and psychoanalysis, which is ongoing. This led to a dialogue between Buddhism and medicine.
Allopathic medicine.
Right, and cognitive behavioral sciences and therapies, which led more recently to a dialogue with neuroscience.
And it's not just Buddhism, though, right? I mean,
Well, Buddhism is kind of a placeholder for Eastern contemplative traditions.
Yeah. But I see more and
Most often these days, it tends to be coming in out of the Buddhist tradition because mindfulness, and we'll get there. But mindfulness is kind of the big thing, and it's on the cover of Time magazine again recently, which was created by Stir. So I think nowadays, and having studied this a little bit in terms of the influence of these different things, Buddhism was, I think, most commonly in dialogue with the West around these human disciplines.
I'm seeing more and more, I mean, Christian traditions, too, getting involved in these kinds of contemplative practices. I mean, I think the fact that the Pope, the current Pope, in fact, and his orientation is having a profound influence on the Christian tradition.
I would agree.
Yeah.
So this kind of an arc, though, I think mirrors what we saw before in terms of a beginning with psychoanalysis and kind of moving through behavior and cognition, and then finally to the brain and the body. And then it has certainly continued, but in sort of fringe ways. It seems to be missing these days with regard to adding contemplative practice into psychotherapy and other healing modalities is this kind of relational, transpersonal, developmental lens.
Yeah.
It tends to still be an intervention that's offered as a cure or as a fix to something that's broken. And it's
rather than a proactive practice.
It's rather than a proactive practice, and rather than a practice that's offered with the full realization that that which I'm doing for myself, I'm also doing for the other.
Right. That's a pretty elevated awareness. The I-thou melding.
Sure, right? That gets to the more profound aspects of integration. So let's envision what a relational contemplative psychology or psychotherapy or any other healing or teaching tradition or parenting for that matter, right? What would it look like? Well, this has an admittedly Buddhist flavor because of my own background and my own biases, but let's just see what it would look like. So it would address the traumatic wounds of the unthought known, which in Buddhism I consider that as addressing karma.
Mm-hmm.
It would examine how thoughts, feelings, and patterns of relating mindlessly play out, right? And this is, and through the lens of Buddhist psychology, this is what we would refer to as conditioned existence, right? We're conditioned to be a certain way, based on what has come before, based on our karma. It would have a trauma lens, a traumatology flavor to it. We would see problems as reenactments with healing trying to happen in spite of the suffering created by our conditioning. Right? Think back to the video of the kid that keeps going back to the emergency room over and over again. This is his conditioning. And it's healing trying to happen. The problem is that it just continues to reenact. And an understanding of this, a compassionate understanding of this would enable us to ask that question that they posed, which was not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
Right.
We can also turn that lens on ourselves and our own suffering. We can meet ourselves with self-compassion, an overall kind of a belief in basic goodness of human beings. Basic goodness is a fundamental tenet in Buddhist psychology.
That's what I love about neuroscience. It makes it easy to see that it's not me, it's my brain.
It's my brain, right. And my brain is fixable. It's not permanently
right.
problematic. It's at least fixable to the degree that my brain is fixable. There are some
limitations.
Limiting factors there, right?
Right.
So a relational contemplative psychology would also have a biological appreciation for how our healing is trying to happen. So we have an understanding of our own brain, our own neurobiology, as well as how suffering is unfolding for all human beings. So this is fostering a sense of deep compassion for ourselves and for others, and seeing ourselves as a part of something larger. And this is fostered through mindfulness practice. It would happen in the here and now, in the safe emergency of the therapeutic situation. And this is what I'm tying to the Bodhisattva ethic in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, which is to say that I offer myself in the service of all beings, for the benefit of all beings. Every practice, every breath I take, everything that I'm doing, I'm offering for the benefit of all beings.
And you don't have to be perfect in that offering.
Oh, no, definitely not. Definitely not. And in the event that I should stumble into enlightenment like Eckhart Tolle did, then I would vow to return again in human form to do it all over again until all beings are liberated. I'll do that over and over again. In Buddhist cosmology, it recognizes the notion of reincarnation. Right? So as a bodhisattva, I'm coming back over and over again until the suffering of all beings is relieved once and for all. And it would occur taking advantage of the prime directive, that is, more organized brains offering resources to less organized brains. There it is again, the Bodhisattva ethics. So the work that I do on myself, I'm literally offering in the form of my body, of my neurobiology, in the presence of another being for the benefit of another being. So every time I sit in meditation, I have an intention, an overarching intention, which we'll get to in a minute when we get into mindfulness a little more deeply, but I set an overarching intention that whatever healing I'm able to do for myself, whatever development I realize in my own spiritual path with this sitting practice, it's going to serve other beings by through the offering of myself, my own body, my own neurobiology to another being in relationship.
So you're a vehicle.
I am a vehicle.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, right. But it's not going to stop there. It's not going to stop with the relief of suffering or symptoms through a medical lens. First of all, it really doesn't even recognize suffering as a medical problem. It recognizes suffering as a function of karma and conditioning. Right? You see, I frequently say this to my clients when they say, for example, when I worked with adolescents in a residential treatment facility, they'd frequently come to me and say, I have an anger problem. And I would say to them back, well, I don't know, how many times has anger saved your bacon? And they'd kind of think to themselves, well, lots of times.
Right.
So, I would say that you've been well served by anger because you're still here. So maybe we can have a more compassionate and appreciative view of the anger that has saved you, and learn to channel it more
skillfully
and skillfully. Right?
Right.
So anger in itself isn't a problem. You just need to learn some new skills and some new, and we need to, and I never said this to the adolescents, but I was thinking in my own mind, we need to create more capacity, more neurobiological capacity to regulate your strong emotions so that you can be more skillful, right? You can act in a new way. And it would also offer the possibility of transcendence of suffering via spiritual development.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about mindfulness, just because mindfulness has become such a buzzword, not just in my industry, psychotherapy, the psychotherapy world, but it's everywhere now. Like I said, it's in the cover of Time magazine. So the Buddha said, I have discovered a nectar-like truth, deep, calm, and simple. Lucidly awake. Whomever I explain it to, no one will understand. So I will remain silent in the jungle. This is what he wrote about his initial awakening. Thank goodness he didn't stay silent in the jungle.
Say that again?
Thank goodness he didn't stay silent in the jungle.
Right.
He went out and started teaching.
He didn't have he let go of that opinion.
He let go of that opinion. Yes, exactly. Exactly. For the benefit of one and all. So mindfulness is all the rage, as I said, in all kinds of things. And so
I don't see banking in there.
Oh, well, you'll see investing.
Right.
But here's mindfulness. We've got mindfulness for idiots. We have institutes for mindful leadership. We have mindful dogs. We have finding peace in a frantic world. We have an 8-week plan. We can find peace in our frantic world in 8 short weeks. We have mindfulness for beginners. Mindfulness in plain English, which I think is it's so funny that mindfulness in plain English was written by a person whose name I can't even begin to pronounce.
It's not his first language.
Right, which is great. And then we have mindfulness for dummies. We have the mindful investor. Right? You can see what's happening here. So what is it? What is mindfulness really? And I like my friend and colleague Shauna Shapiro from Santa Clara University has done a lot of writing about mindfulness, and she breaks it down in terms of big M mindfulness and little m mindfulness. So big M mindfulness is an abiding presence or awareness. It's getting in touch with awareness itself. It's a deep knowing that shows up as this sort of peace and freedom in our minds. And it's a way of being. It's not a thing that we're doing. It's a way that we are. This is how we inhabit our mind, our body, how we show up moment to moment. Big M mindfulness. And then small M mindfulness is more skill-based. It's about the practices that we do. It's about how we learn to do things. And that's broken up into formal and informal practice. That is, we have a sitting practice where we sit down on purpose to pay attention, non-judgmentally, to how our here and now experience is unfolding. But then we take that off the cushion and we take our mindfulness out into the world and how we do our dishes and how we parent and how we drive, how we eat, all of these things. That's known as informal practice, and both are important.
So would you say that big M mindfulness is sort of the natural outgrowth of integration?
I would say so. I think that's more. I think so. Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it.
All right.
It's a natural outgrowth of integration. Yeah. And some of the and the small M mindfulness, the skills are what
We use to get there.
That's right. That's what facilitates the connecting up of all those neurons in all those different directions.
Right.
I just thought this was a cool quote by the Dalai Lama. Man sacrifices his health in order to make money, and then he sacrifices his money to recuperate his health. And then he's so anxious about the future that he doesn't enjoy the present. The result being he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if is never going to die and dies having never really lived. He's a wise, wise soul. So little in mindfulness. Let's break this down a little bit. It starts with intention, as I alluded to earlier in the Bodhisattva ethic. Why do we sit? We sit to learn self-regulation sometimes. What about exploring ourselves? Yeah, sure. Do we sit to become free, to liberate ourselves from suffering? Absolutely. Or is it about service? Yeah, it's about service. It's about the Bodhisattva ethic. So we kind of run through these different kinds of intentions every time we sit and we practice. Then it's about attention, right? Intention and attention. It's about paying attention on purpose to one's moment-to-moment experience. As we talked about in the integration piece, both internally and externally, being able to move fluidly between the internal and the external worlds. And then there's an attitude of letting go of our opinions, letting go of judgment, letting go of our attachments, letting go of striving, letting go of the need to know, letting go of our impatience, learning to trust and accept everything as it is. It's this openness, this attitude of openness and acceptance that we cultivate.
Letting go of the realization that we're all on a developmental path.
Exactly. We got to let go of that. And ultimately, we got to let go of the self who's on any kind of a path at all.
Exactly.
So how does it show up in therapy? How does it show up in practice with other people?
Relationally.
Well, there's mindfulness-informed practices, mindfulness-informed therapies, and we already talked a little bit about Mark Epstein. He's a great example of mindfulness-informed psychotherapy, in his case through a more psychoanalytic lens. But he allows the tenets of Buddhism to infuse his thinking and his conceptualization of how the practice is.
Actually, what's interesting is he was a Buddhist before he was a doctor.
Oh, was he really?
Yeah. Yeah, he went to medical school late.
That makes sense.
He traveled in the East, like I think right out of high school.
He's an amazing guy. Thoughts Without a Thinker is a wonderful book. And so I'm really enjoying The Trauma of Everyday Life as well. So mindfulness informed is we kind of bring the philosophical tenets in to the work, and it infuses who we are, how we show up, and how we think about our healing practice. So that's mindfulness informed. And then there's mindfulness-based practice, which is more manualized, it's skills focused. These are systems that have been developed. Marshall Linehan here developed dialectical behavior therapy. This is Endel Siegel, who developed MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And then this is John Kabat-Zinn, who's kind of the pioneer of all of this in developing mindfulness-based stress reduction at UMass.
So Marcia's at the University of Washington, isn't she?
She is.
Yeah.
She is. I just talked with her assistant today and trying to set up a consultation with her about a complex situation. So she's right here and she's accessible. Let's see. So we have the mindfulness-based manualized skills-focused therapeutic systems, as I already said, MBSR, MBCT, and DBT. Which brings me to the most important way that mindfulness shows up in the healing discipline. We've alluded to it already many different times. Amos Shodrin's quote, "The only reason we don't open our hearts and minds to other people is that they trigger confusion in us that we don't feel brave enough or sane enough to deal with. To the degree that we look clearly and compassionately at ourselves, we feel confident and fearless about looking into someone else's eyes." It's such a beautiful teaching on how all of this can show up if we practice.
Right.
If we integrate. How can that's the crystallization of how I would aspire to show up with another person, whether it's here in my office or. So how does it show up in therapy? In this way. It shows up as the mindful therapist, as an intervention, as I've already said. It fosters attention, a compassionate, non-judgmental attitude, self-compassion and attunement, which is embodied. So this is the idea that we are intrapersonally and interpersonally attuned, the degree to which we can be tracking our own experience with acceptance and compassion, frees us up to track and to be with another person's experience in that way. And which results in an experience of authentic empathy. And ultimately, and I think this is one of the most important things that we can offer, whether we're talking about in parenting or teaching or anything, is a non-anxious presence to another person. This is where we really lend our own neurobiology to it. Anxiety is contagious.
You know, I remember when I was in the process of discovering that I didn't really have the makings of a good therapist. And what tipped me off was the fact that it was clear to me that people really wanted to raise issues, and I didn't feel comfortable having them go there. And they were aware of my discomfort, and they would be protecting me by not going there.
Yeah, wow. Right.
And I wasn't serving them. So that was a big awareness that tipped me off that, this probably isn't a good thing for me to be doing at this point in my life.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That's a courageous realization.
Yeah.
So what if we could get beyond mindfulness? And we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about this in particulars, but I just want to pose the question around the possibility. What if we could transcend the self altogether? What if we could realize some profound non-dual truths and learn to show up in this way for and with each other?
Uh-huh.
I think the way I conceive of this is that mindfulness is kind of a bridge. Mindfulness is a skill that's developing. It's a practice and a way of being that's developing and increasing our neural integration, both for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of other beings. If we really get to that level that Einstein was talking about, this transpirational integration, this is where we kind of go into the more spiritual realms and the more profound.
The big picture realm.
The big picture realm, right? The big picture realm. So I want to just offer this as a meditation on what that might look like through the lens of a famous poet.
Not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen. Not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West. Not out of the ocean or up from the ground. Not natural or ethereal. Not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. I'm not an entity in this world or the next. Did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is the placeless, the trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the beloved. I've seen the two worlds as one, and that one called to and know. First, last, outer, inner. Only that breath, breathing, human being. I belong to the beloved. I've seen the two worlds as one. And that one called to and know first, last, outer, inner. Only that breath, breathing, human being.
So,
It's pretty clear that the mystical poets had a lot of integration going on.
yeah, could you spot all the different kinds of integration in there?
You could actually,
It was really
if you use that
beautiful, wasn't
frame. Yeah.
it? Yeah, it was interesting.
All right. So this has been quite enlightening. You'll be pleased to know that not a single person has dropped off the call.
I'm glad. That's nice.
Isn't it?
That's great. Thank you all for sticking with me.
Yeah. And so we can't have conversations here now, but you do want to. You're happy to engage with people.
I am.
And there's your email address.
There it is. Yeah.
And you welcome all comers. Yeah. So it's
and there's a piece on my on that website if people are interested in going a little deeper with that. I wrote a brief blog entry on applying the 4 ranges as a means of kind of mapping through how I would meet somebody at different levels of integration. Which I'm using here.
Depending on how they showed up and what they were presenting.
Exactly, depending on how they showed up and what they're presenting.
Yeah.
And it includes the whole gamut from being very attached and rigid at the first range, all the way to the capacity to transcend the self and live in that place that Rumi just so beautifully expressed in that poem. So that's available on the website.
So the website is www.seattleintegrativepsychology.com?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, Sean, I must say you know a lot, and you've learned a lot.
I've had good teachers.
Well, one of the ways that
one of them is right there, the one who's speaking. I think I have you to thank for so much of what I've learned, Mark. You're such a generous.
Well, thank you.
Mentor.
But it's really nice to see how you've actually retained it and built on it and put it together into this coherent narrative, basically.
I'm healing from my trauma effectively.
Yeah. It's evident. All right. Well, thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was really a pleasure. It was a lot of fun to do it.
Yeah, I hope people will get in touch with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in 2 weeks, we'll be doing our 12th and final session. And you're invited to listen in if you want, but
I would love to.
okay.
That would be great. Send me an invite.
I will. And then
I may have clients scheduled then, but send me the invitation.
yeah, I will.
That would be great.
All right, folks. So this is it for tonight, and we'll be in touch and look forward to our next session together. All righty?
Thank you.
Take care. Good night.